You're listening to the Veteran Etc. podcast, as there's always more to be said about a veteran. Join your host, Mike Kim, a veteran, ex-monk, seasoned war trauma therapist, and writer, as he shares his years of research in veteran readjustment culture and the meaning of warrior life. Now, here's your host, Mike Kim.
Veteran Etc. This is a cultural show that's tied to veteran readjustment. I'm your host, Mike Kim, and every other week I include a commentary on veteran culture and readjustment. This episode focuses on July 4th, Independence Day. For Americans, this is a deep holiday because it gives the background to the narrative of our country. And for those who served in the military and for those with family members and loved ones tied to the military, it's as important, if not more important, than Veterans Day. Independence Day, at least the way I see it from a historical view, is tied to, well, the rights and responsibilities of all Americans and non-Americans who are living in America. The rights and responsibilities are often minimized or we just pick and choose which rights we want and which responsibilities we want. Seldom do we take the time to look at the Constitution of the United States and truly examine our rights and responsibilities. All this being said, I'm brought to A Few Good Men, a movie that touched my heart back in 1992 as I finished one of the 4 stints in the military at Yale University. So I had served in three different times before becoming a monk and then serving again in Iraq. I was in studies at Yale University, and A Few Good Men was being shown, and my classmates and I checked out the movie. I had classmates from the different schools, the law school, the graduate school, the colleges, the undergraduate colleges. I went to Yale and I studied psychology of religion, philosophy of religion, and comparative religion, and a couple other areas, interdisciplinary areas. In my studies, I think the common questions that would come up over and over again was actually Aristotle's question, and that is, who am I as a person? Aristotle's the first philosopher to ask that question. At Yale, because I had just finished my time in the military, my third experience, and if you would count Norwich University, the Military College of Vermont, as another military setting that was tied to my sense of being, well, that adds to the narrative of becoming a veteran. And so we add that. So it wasn't just serving in the military 4 different times. And again, I'm not some type of hero, but I'm just telling you that I served in different branches and at different times. And in many ways, it was tied to different opportunities that came my way. And I would also add Norwich University as one environment that was a military environment that is tied to my veteran narrative. And so while I was at Yale, I had time to reflect on that question, that one question that Aristotle posed as far as who am I as a person? I extended that question, and I continue to extend that question now in my research that goes back to the 90s. And I think that the movie, A Few Good Men, is tied to all of this. Why do I say that? I say that because when I look at myself and I say, who am I? And I ask these other questions of who am I and what am I to be? And that's the other question that Aristotle poses for his readers. These are dominant questions in ancient times and in present time. It's a question that even was involved when I was a monk, when I was a Catholic friar monk, and I invested 10 years of my life in that life. And the Aristotelian question was transformed into the theological or the religious question or the spiritual question that Thomas Aquinas brought up. And that is, who are you as a spiritual being? In other words, I began to ask myself when I was a monk, who am I as a spiritual person? I think all of that also made me ask the question, not just as who am I as a human being, as a person, who am I as a spiritual being, but who am I as a veteran being? So I bring this up because cultural production in many ways is tied to this question that I present. And I think there's many misunderstandings in regards to cultural analysis. I think whether you're coming from a centrist approach or from the right or from the left, you're asking this type of question. What am I all about? Now, as a veteran, I asked that using history, using different approaches towards meaning making and interpretation. These are things that I learned while studying philosophy and theology at Yale. These are ancient skills that are seldom used these days, but are recognized in certain ways in our culture. I do think that people in different mass media circles and domains, they do ask these questions that I present. But I think they do it in such a rapid, accelerated way, and they do it in a way where, I heard Tim Pool, the social media figure, a dominant one, who has millions of followers. He basically says that in the morning, I heard this recently, that he looks at Twitter for his news, for his information on the news. And I'm wondering if that is something that my great heroes like Abraham Lincoln, like Aristotle, like Aquinas, to be modern. I mean, even William F. Buckley, even though I don't agree with him, that debate with James Baldwin is incredible. And both of them are asking these deeper questions and do not have fear and are not trying to gain mass media support. But these folks are trying to take a stab at the truth. And so I'm veering off from, or leaving to a certain extent, the central issue that I'm talking about today, but yet it's all tied. And how it is because Independence Day, freedom, by having this knowledge, independence is about this knowledge of self and of where one is supposed to go and where one is supposed to become. And in many ways, the roadmap for this independence is not just conflict, because we did have this issue of conflict, revolution, rebellion to acquire independence from the colonial powers of the Brits. Now, what was added to all that was this mindfulness by this country's founders. Imperfect as they were, they made America as a project for all of us to participate in. And so it's okay to blame people for errors in our narrative as far as the rights and responsibilities and the care that is mentioned in the Constitution. It's also important to recognize the different positive ways we've helped people to improve their lives. And even in all of our imperialism and also our domestic difficulties with race and slavery and oppression of immigrants, there has still been the call to improve things. Why? Because of the constitutional spirit of our Constitution. And that's why I look at the movie A Few Good Men. Now, in the movie, if you remember, I mean, we all remember Jack Nicholson talk about freedom and that we pretty much have our freedom because of men like him, you know, who are willing to put their lives on the line and defend the country against imminent aggression from the enemy. In Colonel Jessup's words, Jack Nicholson's character in A Few Good Men, those words, are you willing to stand there in defense? And he points to Tom Cruise, Lieutenant Kaffee, the attorney interrogating Colonel Jessup in regards to his role in the Code Red incident that in the movie led to the death of Private Santiago and also left vulnerable the peers of Private Santiago, those peers in the trial. That was the central focus. It wasn't Colonel Jessup's speech of, you can't handle the truth, although we get obsessed in media culture with that dramatic performance. But if you look deeper into things throughout the years, I've been taken by the peers of Private Santiago in the trial that was featured in A Few Good Men. We have two Marines who they're given leniency of Private Santiago. So they're not responsible for murder. They're not responsible for manslaughter, but they have some type of responsibility. And we see at the end of the movie, the two Marines who were the peers of Santiago, one Marine mentions that he's surprised about dishonorable discharge or other than honorable discharge that he's going to receive along with the other Marine. And he's in complete shock because he felt that he was minding the orders of his superiors. And the other Marine corrected the surprised Marine. The other Marine basically said that those Marines should have been protecting Santiago because Santiago was weak and that there needed to be that type of treatment versus carrying out a code red is basically extrajudicial. It's kind of like corrective action, informal corrective action, basically taking the rules and regulations, taking the rules and regs and throwing them away and taking care of the situation, the disciplinary situation in a combat situation or in a garrison situation, taking it upon yourself or your group to correct this person who is, as the thought goes, and this is just the thought, that is a threat to the survival of the unit and also danger to him or herself. That's the mentality of a Code Red or a blanket party. You saw the blanket party in Full Metal Jacket. If you saw that movie, Full Metal Jacket, you see Private Pyle basically get this blanket party because he's holding down the platoon in boot camp. And in the end, completely loses his mind and ends up killing the senior drill instructor, played by Lee Ermey. That's an interesting movie to look at. Stanley Kubrick movie, Full Metal Jacket. But getting back to the narrative of A Few Good Men and how that's tied to the 4th of July and Independence Day, I would say that the movie is so important, not just for veterans, but for civilians, because it points out that even in the military, in the elite Marine Corps, there is a recognition that you're not just a Marine. Again, the central question that I pointed out before, who am I, right? In the trial, you see this over and over again in different ways. You see Colonel Jessup, he identifies in who he is as far as his function as, as a Marine, being out there and doing whatever he can and whatever he wants to make sure that he has Marines fending and holding the line. And that's one approach towards rights and responsibilities. And in many ways, he and the other Marines are lost in this questioning of who are they supposed to be, right? Because in the end, during the interrogation by Lieutenant Caffey, Jack Nicholson, Colonel Jessup loses it and admits to giving the code red, giving this order, which was implied in many ways and at the same time not implied. And so he loses it and admits to giving the order of code red. But at the same time, earlier, he's explaining to the court that he wanted to protect Private Santiago, and that in his desire to protect Private Santiago from his peers and his immediate NCOs, I guess, corporals and sergeants, and I think some lance corporals, I think, were involved supposedly in this code red in the movie. It's been a while since I watched the movie, but we've got here a problem because Colonel Jessup, in all of his bravado, is actually saying that he did everything to protect Private Santiago, and in that was trying to get Private Santiago into a safe zone by transferring him from the dangers of being in his platoon. Now, in the end, we see that Jack Nicholson, that Colonel Jessup, is torn between truth, reality, and lies. And we also see how Lieutenant Caffey was able to pursue the truth. And it's central in regards to looking at our country as far as the rights and responsibilities we have. And I think that A Few Good Men was created, and I think it became such a successful movie, bringing in millions of dollars, because the movie tied in the message of who am I as an American with my rights, with my responsibilities. I think it comes up over and over again in the movie, whether it's who's accountable for Santiago's life. Does he matter? Does Colonel Jessup's career have more of a priority for him to make general than two Marine lower enlisted who are facing charges of murder and life imprisonment in a military prison? What does that all mean? And not just in the military, but in America. I think we do ask those questions, and they're not always answered. And in many ways, they're often answered poorly. But I have seen when those answers and the questioning and answering of rights and responsibilities are brought up, and I just think of certain instances in American history and also in my life, in my military life, where I had to stand up and I had to be a whistleblower while I was in the military, in the Coast Guard. And when I was in federal service years after, and the evidence that I had successfully pursued my whistleblower is that I was able to have a long career in the federal government and also work with DOD as a federally equivalent to the rank of major. And I was also able to rejoin the military with no problems. And I served in Iraq. I volunteered at the age of 40. And for me, all of this brings me back to the question of who am I and what are my rights and responsibilities, and what are the rights and responsibilities of my subordinates, my peers, and my superiors. And I think at times things got hazy. And I would say that America has an interesting approach towards looking at all of this. If you notice, our Uniform Code of Military Justice, and I think it is original in many ways and different in many ways from other expressions of military law. I'd love to ask my JAG friend, John Barrett, this question, but how is our system of military law different from other systems of military law around the world? Well, one thing that I know for a fact that comes out is that what's very original is this issue of defying an unlawful order. Or how could I say? Yeah, defying a unlawful order. I think the immediate, instant obedience to orders is preached in a lot of different militaries. I think in the US military, we're different. And examples of this is in the case of My Lai, or in the Nuremberg trial, where the United States military held a military court and basically condemned these, as well as Japanese imperialists and others who were tied to war crimes, serious war crimes. Now, that doesn't excuse our instances, the US military's instances of war crimes. What I'm saying is that there is an actual standard, and that is what we need to recognize. We have a standard of behavior in the US military where, of any rank, if there's an unlawful order, you have the right and you also have the responsibility to defy that order. And so that question is brought up in many ways in the trial, featured in A Few Good Men, where the two Marines may get some grace from the court, but there's no absolution. There's no complete, how could I say, resolve regarding their participation in the death of Private Santiago, this malingerer, this Marine who did not seem to fit into the Marine Corps as far as what was demanded of him on the line, on that line, right? To be on that line, what Colonel Jessup wanted, these Marines to be completely dedicated and completely able to guard that line. And that's important. I mean, I would say that's important, but is that everything? I wouldn't say that's everything. And I think that's why the movie is important. And this movie, A Few Good Men, is also tied to the Constitution and other Americans. Because I ask you, have you been in situations where you have been compromised? Your rights have been compromised, or you have compromised the rights of others, and you have ignored your responsibilities. Have there been times where you've honored the rights of others and you took on properly your responsibility for yourself? And I don't give Private Santiago a pass, but what I do give him is the right. He has a right, according to our Constitution, to write letters, even in uniform. He did in the movie, to his congressman to expose the command at Guantanamo. This is where these Marines are at, guarding the line against the Cubans, during the end of the Cold War, but still resistant Cuba towards the United States. This Cold War mentality of defending the line in Guantanamo against the Cubans. And Private Santiago mentioned that Marines were provoking the Cubans by shooting off their weapons outside of the wire, outside of the line. And this troubled Colonel Jessup. But we've got a question. Did it trouble Colonel Jessup because of his desire for his career to advance? He was a colonel, and was he looking at making general? And any little fragment in your career will prevent you from becoming an admiral or a general in the military. And so basically, it seems from the narrative in the movie that Jessup was more concerned about his career above all else, although he was using the facade of defending the country and being on that line and putting the risks of his life and his men. That's the narrative Colonel Jessup used. And at the same time, it seemed to ignore the core values within the American military that's tied to the U.S. Constitution, and that's the rights of and responsibilities. The preamble has like six to seven areas that cover this. And we see that our laws are tied to this, and it's tied to the welfare of the people, freedom, some other themes, respect, and the other values within the Constitution that's kicked off by the preamble. These are all themes that call us to be better Americans. And I think that the movie A Few Good Men, although not maybe accurate, may not have been a drama that was based on reality, we can say that there are certain realities that were taken to create the movie. And those realities include a real court martial that happened in 1986. This court martial was, I wouldn't say the same story or narrative as what was presented in the Rob Reiner movie, A Few Good Men. But the case back in 1986 involved Guantanamo. There wasn't a Colonel Jessup, but a Colonel Samuel Adams, who had supposedly a personality like Colonel Jessup, and in many ways was shielded from an incident that involved a Marine very similar to Santiago. His name's William Alvarado. So William Alvarado was given a blanket party, was given a code red by his peers. And his peers, there were I think 10 of them that basically gave Willie Alvarado a goodbye present in the form of a blanket party, because Alvarado was having problems with the unit, and the officer in charge of the base, Colonel Sam Adams, he allowed the transfer to happen, but he also was caught up with getting in. Now, the character in the movie that's not really dealt with much, that is actually someone I can connect to, and someone who I think embodies a lot of what America is all about, is actually not the hero Lieutenant Kaffee who uncovers the truth, that he wants the truth. And then the other, the villain, Colonel Jessup, who's focused on his career and will do anything to throw his troops under the bus to pursue his career, under the guise of honor and virtue and the perception of truth, with his great line, "You can't handle the truth." Now, it's looking at the anti-hero in Lieutenant Colonel Markinson. Do you remember that character in the movie? That character in the movie is the Marine who's under Colonel Jessup. He's the one who recommends to Jessup to transfer Santiago out of the unit. And Jessup doesn't agree and is wanting to basically have Santiago silenced. Not saying Jessup wanted Santiago to be killed, but he definitely wanted Santiago to keep his mouth shut, to quit sending those letters to the congressman, and to just be a brainwashed Marine without an understanding of the UCMJ in many ways. Because for Colonel Jessup to imply that Private Santiago does not have the right to contact his congressman about these problems that are happening in his unit, that is an implied norm, order that can be disobeyed, because it's in Santiago's right, even if he's this hardcore Marine or misfit Marine, he has the right as an American citizen in that uniform to contact his congressman. He also has the right to not be as physically fit if he has physical conditions that are preventing him from becoming the top standard. You just basically properly transfer the person away to a setting that's going to fit his skills and his needs, as they're tied to the Marine Corps and the military goals. No one's just giving someone like Santiago a pass, but he's still got rights. And he also has the responsibility of his oath. But we can't deny one thing. We have to recognize rights and responsibilities. And this is the same thing now, going back to the real court martial, the trial involving Alvarado in reality did not die. And as I said earlier, the base commander, Colonel Adams, basically in many ways is more questionable than the fiction of Colonel Jessup, because Colonel Adams actually gives Alvarado the transfer, but is hesitant and implies in many ways, as it comes out in the transcripts of the trial. You can find this information in the New York Times. If you look up A Few Good Men in the New York Times, A Few Good Men in Unsolved Mysteries, it's interesting. I was tied to Unsolved Mysteries as I was the military liaison officer to the show at one time. Not all of the shows, but a couple of the episodes. That's just to show you the many different jobs I had in the military. And yeah, that was an interesting collateral duty I had. But it's quite interesting that in reality, there's a haze between the fiction of A Few Good Men and what really happened, like in the trial, right? To a certain extent, to a large part, it's fiction, and I'll explain how it's also tied to some aspects of realities, not a reality. The reality is the actual trial. How it's shared, how it's interpreted, those are realities. But the actual trial and looking at the transcripts, you can see that there were lawyers. It wasn't just one Lieutenant Caffey. There was a team of lawyers. The most pronounced are Chris Johnson, David Iglesias, and then Marcari, and a few others. Bansley, of some Connecticut, old Connecticut family. These folks were tied to the real case involving the situation of Willie Alvarado. Willie Alvarado did not die. So let's just say that. But at the same time, people, if they read up on this case, they'll find out that Willie experiences a near-death health condition due to the code red that he received from this going away gift, right? That Colonel Adams, and I'm not going to say this is pathological, but in a way, I will say it's definitely sadistic, right? The misfit Marine is supposed to be transferred. And in many ways, Colonel Adams is not recognizing his responsibility to all the Marines and to the safety of all the Marines on base. And he's basically unleashing the peers of Alvarado, because Alvarado did, like the character Santiago, Alvarado did write congressmen and told them about, his treatment, his mistreatment in the unit, his health conditions. Guess he was having problems with the physical fitness of what was the environment there in Guantanamo, 110-degree heat. I'm not giving him a pass. I'm just mentioning these different things. Maybe this Alvarado needed to have his MOS switched or his assignment switched. Eventually that ended up happening. So why involve all of this drama, right? Why not just become a better manager, a better leader, a better recognizer of the U.S. Constitution, that there are rights and responsibility to even a Marine, a low-ranking Marine. That's what Colonel Adams needed to pursue, and that's the type of culture he needed to promote on base, and especially with the peers of Alvarado and the immediate superiors of Alvarado. And I've seen this done in reality. I've seen it done. I've also seen it done when things are mismanaged. And that's unfortunate. It shows a lack of true leadership. And a good example, reading the World War II history of the generals, I think Thomas Ricks writes about this. And I think I came across it either at Norwich or reading up on Ricks' interpretation of Eisenhower. But basically, Eisenhower was a master general, master military leader, because he knew how to use his generals and place them in the right places. And so when it came to the Kasserine Pass in World War II, the Africa campaign, the U.S. suffered a terrible defeat there. And the failure of a general American general who basically hid and allowed troops to be killed. There's blood on his hands. Eisenhower, what did Eisenhower do? Eisenhower did not keep him in the unit. He brought him back home and had him not court-martialed, had him set up in a training unit. And he was able to live out the rest of the World War II as an officer with respect. And Eisenhower took a chance in doing that because the press knew about all of the loss of lives in the Africa campaign. And at that time, the United States did not have dominance in the war. And Eisenhower took a chance. But that's what a true leader does. And I think a true leader like Eisenhower also recognized the importance of rights and responsibility. He would later, Eisenhower, become president of the United States. And though not perfect, did intervene in regards to violations of civil rights in the South by sending the 101st Airborne and 82nd Airborne to the Deep South to prevent the Ku Klux Klan and other racist groups from committing crimes against African Americans. So the military was activated. And I'm not talking about National Guard. I mean, Eisenhower deployed the military, the active military force, domestic. And it wasn't, it wasn't Katrina or any natural disaster. It was done to protect the lives of those Americans who happen to be African Americans. And so this is the issue of rights and responsibilities. And when we talk about Independence Day, and again, when we look at this trial involving the real trial was noticed by another JAG officer, Deborah Sorkin, whose brother at that time was, I believe, a screenwriter and also a playwright. And she gave information about the trial to Aaron Sorkin. And Sorkin ended up writing the play A Few Good Men. And that was written in like 1989. It's later bought by Rob Reiner and the movie's done, and then it's distributed in 1992. But just to give you a little bit of history tied to A Few Good Men, Aaron Sorkin's sister, Deborah Sorkin, is a Navy lawyer and is aware of the case and tells her brother of what the ironies, the case, the many different ironies. And one irony that I don't mention in the real case that I did allude to that I engaged in the movie narrative is the situation with David Cox as being somewhat tied to the two Marines being accused and given a dishonorable discharge, or they're not prosecuted for murder, but they ended up going to trial and they lost the trial. David Cox is one of the Marines, one of the 10 Marines involved in the situation with Alvarado's case. And Alvarado doesn't die. He survives, though his injury is pretty severe. He needed to be medevaced and taken to different hospitals for his recovery, and then given distance from his unit and transferred to Washington, D.C., and given an assignment that fit him for the rest of his time in the Marine Corps. But what was really interesting about the case is the real case is that David Cox is one to say, I'm not going to take any plea bargains, because most of the folks ended up taking plea bargains, those involved in the Code Red. They took plea bargains. They got other than honorable discharges, which is very heavy. People don't know how heavy that type of a discharge has on your life. I mean, you basically are limited in regards to the veteran education benefits, the VA services. It's a really harsh type of punishment in many ways, that type of a discharge. Or I should say, there's a heavy price to that type of a discharge. And in the plea deal, much like Caffey, Lieutenant Caffey was trying to initially get the Marines to take a plea deal, and the Marines chose to go up for full court martial. I mean, go up to court, full trial. The thing is, we've got to recognize that in reality, that David Cox, the one Marine who was tied to the Code Red, he basically demands a trial, and he must be given a fair trial, right? This is under the Constitution and under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And in the process of the trial, he is saying that Colonel Adams, much like Colonel Jessup in the movie A Few Good Men, is giving implied orders. Now, David Cox is not found guilty of murder. He's actually allowed to go on in the Marine Corps and remain in the Marine Corps, and he ends up having an honorable discharge from the Marine Corps after time spent in the Marine Corps, unlike the others. And I think maybe some others had their discharges upgraded. I'm not sure, but I suspect that's the case with some of them. But with David Cox, he brings up a whole nother issue of rights and responsibilities, because he's saying that a power much larger than himself, than David Cox, Colonel Adams's power and the superiors have this overwhelming power that wasn't order, but David Cox seems to claim that he was somewhat brainwashed. Now, that's my interpretation. And so I think the jury gives some, and the judge gives some accommodations to that situation. And so while David Cox is reprimanded, he's still allowed to continue with his career. And we can learn from this. Again, this issue of rights and responsibilities, we need to ask ourselves in the things that we do, how are we limiting these rights and responsibilities of others and of ourselves? And what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a veteran as far as having these rights and responsibilities? I'm very grateful for Norwich University and Professor Toner and Professor Pappas for teaching military history and military ethics in a way that recognizes the more expansive view of rights and responsibilities regarding taking an oath, and also in being a leader and being an officer. And this was well before the movie. I mean, I graduated from Norwich Military College of Vermont in 1990. But what was interesting in the courses that I took in military history and American military ethic, that there was more to be said other than just studying international law, studying battles, studying the Uniform Code of Military Justice. There is always this pursuit, and I still continue this, to examine. And that's why I named this podcast, and it's tied to readjustment, veteran readjustment culture. It's tied to more to be said or more to reflect on. And that name, Veteran, etc., says it all. And always remember that your freedom is tied to the rights and responsibilities that you have, but at the same time, how you yourself connect that to the world that you live in, to the people that you serve, to the oaths that you take. And that's important.
Veteran Etc. invites you to join us again with your host, Mike Kim, every Sunday. If the content from this podcast is informative to you, please share the podcast with others. Give a like and or post something you learned from the episode on social media. If interested in other truly informative podcasts like Veteran Etc., check out ComingHomeWell.com for a listing of other veteran-based podcasts. Thank you for tuning in.